Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to explain the most important concept in high-level competitive Pokemon, middle ground plays. Many of you have heard me briefly discuss this idea before, but this will be a very in-depth guide with lots of examples from real games. So what is a middle ground play? Simply put, a middle ground play is when you choose an option that covers many or all of your opponent's options. This is often contrasted with prediction, which is when you make a play that covers one or very few of your opponent's options. Low-level players often predict very frequently. Their thought process is, I predict that my opponent will do this, so I'll make a decision based on that assumption. High-level players predict sometimes, but more often use middle grounds. A high-level player would think, my opponent will likely do this, this, or this, so I'll make a decision that covers many of these possibilities, even if it doesn't cover any particular play as powerfully as a prediction would. These plays can be offensive and focused on breaking your opponent's team, or defensive and intended to minimize damage to your team. Middle ground plays can be applied to almost any situation. Now, if this sounds confusing, don't worry, we'll go over plenty of examples. There are 6 basic steps to make a middle ground play. Number 1, identify all of your opponent's likely options. This is the stage where you simply compile all the things that your opponent may do. For many, this is the hardest part of middle ground plays. Identifying the many things your opponent could do is sometimes easy, but other times very complicated. Let's take a look at an example. I ended up leading with Landorus against my opponent's presumably Mega Mawile. What are my opponent's likely plays? One obvious play is Ice Punch. My Landorus is extremely bulky and can actually take an Ice Punch, but my opponent probably doesn't know that. Another likely play is switching out into Buzzwole, Mandibuzz, or Landorus. All of these Pokemon don't mind taking an Earthquake, and perhaps my opponent wants to preserve health on their Mawile, since my Tapu Lele Moonblast is so threatening. There are a lot of plays I can also throw out immediately. I don't think Mawile will click Sucker Punch here, that would make no sense. That would go poorly for my opponent in almost every scenario. I also don't think my opponent will go for Swords Dance. Going for a sweep this early makes no sense, and I have tons of Pokemon that can resist or outright block Sucker Punch. I also don't expect my opponent will switch into Blacephalon. It would get destroyed by an Earthquake even after Mawile's Intimidate, and it doesn't particularly like facing a full health Landorus. Some plays are more in the middle though. Maybe the Mawile could use Knockoff? It wouldn't make a lot of sense, since removing my Landorus's item in exchange for me setting Stealth Rock or Earthquaking Mawile is definitely a trade in my favor, but maybe they predict a switch and want to remove an item? Maybe my opponent makes a risky switch into Pawmot and tries to Ice Punch my Landorus? These are possibilities, but not very likely ones. For the rest of my thought process, I'm going to stick to the 4 plays that I consider most likely by far. Mawile clicking Ice Punch, switching into Buzzwole, Mandibuzz, or Landorus. If you struggle to identify your opponent's likely plays, there's really only one way to fix that. Playing a lot of games, preferably on ladder. Top players like myself aren't geniuses that can get inside the opponent's head like crazy. We've just played so many games that we're familiar with a lot of situations, and we know what people typically do in those situations. A good exercise to develop this awareness is try to identify your opponent's likely plays every turn. And if they do something unexpected, ask yourself why. If you can't come up with a reason, it could be that your opponent made a mistake and just made a bad play. But if your opponent's play made some sense, and especially if it ended up working out well for them, don't get upset and call the play ridiculous. Try to understand why they did it. This will help you in identifying likely plays in the future. It should also be noted that likely plays for one player are usually the same as any other player, but if you notice your opponent making plays that you consider improbable, they may have a unique play style that you'll need to adjust to. For example, if your opponent is very fond of going for hard reads, the pool of likely plays will probably be larger. Once you've identified the most likely options that your opponent will select and disregarded the distant and unlikely possibilities, you're ready for step 2, identifying your own reasonable options. Consider which of your options do a reasonably good job of covering many or all of your opponent's options. Just like with your opponent, some choices can be disregarded immediately. In this case, I'm definitely not going to go into Tyranitar here. If my opponent leaves Mawile in, that puts me in a bad spot, and if my opponent switches into Buzzwole or Landorus, I'm also in a bad spot. A Tyranitar switch only works out well if my opponent switches into Mandibuzz, meaning 3 out of 4 of options make Tyranitar a bad choice here. I only really have 2 good options. One, I can stay in and click Earthquake, damaging Mawile to soften up the team for Tapu Lele, or 2, I can U-turn out. Number 3, consider which of your opponent's plays are most likely. I've identified 4 likely options from my opponent. Stay in and Ice Punch, switch into Landorus, switch into Mandibuzz, and switch into Buzzwole. But which are the most likely? I'd say that the most likely is staying in and clicking Ice Punch. Landorus is an extremely common lead, and my opponent likely knew this when they decided to lead with Mawile. I would say the 3 switching options are about equal in probability. Maybe Landorus slightly more likely to get up rocks. Next, number 4. Consider how well your options cover your opponent's likely options. Remember, in this situation, I've identified 2 reasonable plays to make. Stay in and Earthquake, or U-turn out. Earthquake works well if Mawile stays in, but goes poorly if it switches. U-turn is the best if Mawile switches out, but it's far from catastrophic if Mawile stays in. Number 5. Consider the cost if your opponent selects the option that your middle ground play does not cover. If Mawile stays in, Earthquake is ideal since I can chip Mawile significantly for my Specs Tapu Lele. If Mawile switches out, U-turn is ideal so I can go into Tapu Lele and click a powerful attack. But what if I get it wrong? What if I Earthquake as Mawile switches out, or U-turn as Mawile stays in? If I Earthquake as Mawile switches out, I end up in a pretty bad spot. Basically, one of these 3 Pokemon will enter for free. Now, this could be varying levels of bad depending on their set. It wouldn't be catastrophic, but it's certainly not ideal. If I U-turn as Mawile stays in, this isn't a problem at all. I can easily go into Aegislash to take the Ice Punch, and even in the worst case scenario of some unlikely play like Knockoff, my Aegislash really doesn't care. Swords Dance Aegislash is far from helpful against a Mandibuzz team anyway. And finally, step 6. Make the play. Click the button. In this case, U-turn is the clear winner, as it goes well for me in pretty much every situation. If Mawile stays in, I can safely assume it's going to click Ice Punch and just go into Aegislash. If it switches out, I U-turn and get to bring in Tapu Lele. So, to reiterate the difference between prediction and middle ground, if I was 100% certain that Mawile was staying in, I'd click Earthquake. But the cost of clicking Earthquake and being wrong could give my opponent an opportunity to bring in a Pokemon for free. That's definitely worse than Aegislash taking 15% from an Ice Punch. I think my opponent's most likely play is to stay in and Ice Punch, and as I said, if they do stay in and Ice Punch, Earthquake is the optimal play. And yet, there's a slightly worse play that covers way more options and is only a little bit worse if Mawile stays in. If I was a prediction-based player, I'd click Earthquake here. But as someone who utilizes middle grounds, U-turn is correct. Let's see what happened. Mawile stays in, I U-turn, bring in Aegislash, and sure enough, the Ice Punch comes out, dealing 13%. In this case, the predictors would have been ahead. But over the course of a game, you eventually miss predictions. Covering many options leads to victory far more often than trying to predict exactly what your opponent will do. It should also be noted that I do not consciously go through this process every turn. That would take way too long. I explained this situation very in depth to help you all understand the reasoning behind the process, but once you've practiced middle grounds a lot, it becomes second nature. In the actual game, this decision took me about 5 seconds to make. I didn't mentally start going through these 6 steps, I just thought, Mawile will only stay in to click Ice Punch, so I can U-turn out here and just go into a resist if it stays in. The only time I actually consciously go through these 6 steps is when a turn is really difficult or complicated. Still, breaking it down into steps can be a really good exercise if you're learning to make middle grounds. If you find it takes you too long and you're running out of time in games, a good way to practice is watching top-level replays, pausing them each turn, predicting what the likely plays are, and then seeing what ends up happening. It may seem like a lot, but I promise you, with practice, middle ground playing will become automatic for you. Let's continue watching this game. So Mawile stays in and clicks Ice Punch as I go into Aegislash. Here I'm going to make another middle ground play. My opponent's likely plays are to stay in and click Knockoff, switch into Mandibuzz, and switch into Landorus. To cover all of these, I go into Zapdos. Zapdos matches up well into most sets of Landorus and Mandibuzz, and if Mawile stays in and clicks Knockoff, Zapdos won't take much damage and might get paralysis on Mawile from its ability Static. Sure enough, in comes Mandibuzz, and guess what? We're going to make another middle ground. I expect that my opponent will either stay in with Mandibuzz, maybe to throw off a Toxic, go into Palmot, or switch into Landorus. To cover all of these plays, I click Hurricane. And once again, in comes Landorus, and it takes a Hurricane. Now, Hurricane hits this entire team pretty well, so I make another middle ground and just click Hurricane again. Now, I didn't see Explosion coming, but my Zapdos survives just fine. And now in comes the Palmot. Now, I expect my opponent will either click Ice Punch, Revival Blessing, or Double Shock. So I go into Aegislash. It takes everything well except for a Double Shock, and the cost of getting hit by that isn't bad at all. As I said, Swords Dance Aegislash isn't that valuable against a Mandibuzz team. So in comes Aegislash, and there's the Ice Punch. You probably won't be surprised to learn I'm going to make another middle ground play. I expect my opponent's likely plays are to click Revival Blessing or switch into Mandibuzz. To cover both, I go for a close combat. And there's the Revival Blessing. And close combat comes off and gets some nice chip. Now, at this point, I think my opponent will either go for the kill on Aegislash with Double Shock or switch into Mandibuzz. Here I decide to not go for a middle ground. I've been switching around a lot, and I think my opponent may be getting desperate for a kill. I decide to stay in and Shadow Sneak. I know this is a low-risk option because Mandibuzz is very easy for my team to deal with, so if it comes in, it's not the end of the world. And unfortunately, Mandibuzz does come in. Time to make more middle ground plays, the read did not work out. I identify the likely options as Foul Play, U-Turn, Knockoff, and Toxic. I think the most likely is U-Turn and Toxic. My opponent really doesn't want my Tapu Lele to come in for free, given how scary Moonblast looks. So, to cover both U-Turn and Toxic, I go for Shadow Claw. Go for Shadow Claw comes out, and look, it works out, there's the Toxic. This may seem like a really oddly risky play, but remember step 5. Consider the cost if your middle ground play ends up not covering the option that your opponent selects. What if Mandibuzz went for Foul Play or Knockoff? Well, Aegislash dies, and as we established, it's not that important. That would give me a perfect entry opportunity for Tapu Lele. This middle ground also shows off that middle ground plays and safe plays are not the same thing. They have a lot of overlap, but middle ground plays are all about probability management. This play, clicking Shadow Claw against a Mandibuzz, may seem really risky and aggressive, but in reality it's very calculated. A safe play would be to never risk Aegislash like this. So just remember, middle ground plays are not just safe plays. Sometimes middle ground plays appear almost like aggressive reads. Now this turn though, the probability shifts. I've already stayed in once, so now I'm thinking that Foul Play is by far the most likely option that my opponent will go for. So I decide to go into Tapu Lele. And there we go, Lele gets hit with the Foul Play. Once again, we'll go for a middle ground. I expect my opponent will go into Mawile here, and I have Hidden Power, which could do around 70% to Mawile, or I could go for Moonblast, which will do around 40 and not get the 2-hit KO. Mawile is definitely the most likely play, but it's not the only play. What if Blacephalon comes in? What if my opponent just decides to sack Mandibuzz and preserve Mawile's health? Moonblast is simply the best option here. It covers everything. Mawile comes in, I get good damage with Moonblast, and I know Mawile won't be switching in again. I end up making middle ground plays almost this entire game, and I end with a 5-0 victory, all without predicting my opponent a single time. At this point, you probably have a pretty good understanding of middle ground plays and how they work. But there's one more crucial topic we need to review before I end the video. When do you not make middle ground plays? Before we get into that, please remember to subscribe, like, and leave a comment if you're enjoying the video. It helps out a lot. Midgrounds are very powerful and a great skill to have, but you shouldn't use them every turn. There are 3 situations where you don't want to make a middle ground play. Number 1, there's a free play. Sometimes you don't have to analyze or consider your opponent's likely plays at all. You may have a button that covers absolutely everything. If you see a play that's free and works well no matter what your opponent does, just go for it. Here's an example. In this game, I lead with Urshifu and U-turn on Charizard turn 1. Primarina comes in, I get the U-turn off, and I can tell based on the calc that it's not that physically bulky. So I bring in my Tapu Lele. Here, there is no reason to make a middle ground or consider my opponent at all. No matter what, I click Psyshock here. My opponent has no Psychic Immune or even Psychic Resist, and if Primarina stays in, I get the 1-hit KO. So I go for Psychic and pick up my kill. No middle ground, just a free play. Number 2, you may not want to make a middle ground if you have a bad matchup or you're losing the game. If you're in a dire situation, you probably can't afford to make middle ground plays. Remember when I said earlier that middle ground plays cover many options, but usually at the expense of covering any particular option very well? Sometimes you need to predict and go for maximum impact to have a chance at winning a game. A good example of this is an endgame I played against a Sand team. Now, here I have my Urshifu against an opposing Urshifu. This is a banded set locked into Surging Strikes, and my Urshifu is Scarf and has yet to reveal any attacks. I know I'm in a bad spot here. My Zapdos and Kartana are dead, and my opponent has a banded Urshifu that essentially claims a kill every time it comes in. On the flip side, my opponent has Pokemon that can wall everything I have. I'm definitely in a losing spot right now. I predict Scizor will come in, so I go for a Surging Strikes with Urshifu, and I was correct. I know Scizor will want to Roost here, so as Scizor goes for Roost, I go into Tapu Lele. Sure enough, Scizor roosts. Now, my opponent may suspect I have Hidden Power Fire. Why else would I switch Tapu Lele into a full health Scizor? The middle ground play here is Psychic. Psychic hits everything hard and does nearly half to most Scizor sets. But I can't afford to make a middle ground play here. I need to make a prediction. If I suspect Scizor is going to stay in, I need to click Hidden Power Fire. If I think Scizor will switch out, I need to click Psychic. If I click Hidden Power Fire as my opponent switches out, I lose. If I click Psychic as Scizor stays in, I also lose. I predict that Scizor stays in, and I click Hidden Power Fire. Fortunately, my prediction was correct, and as a result of this prediction, I managed to win the game. The third reason you might not want to make a mid-ground is to avoid becoming too predictable. Like any decision-making system, if you use it every turn, middle ground plays can become predictable. If you're facing a less skilled player, or you have a very good matchup, you probably can make middle ground plays every turn and win without any issue. If you're facing a stronger player or playing a more even matchup, though, you shouldn't make middle ground plays absolutely every turn. Going for an occasional hard read keeps your opponent guessing and makes you harder to predict. Remember how I said earlier that different players can have different likely plays? If you sprinkle some hard reads into your game among the middle ground plays, your opponent will have to deal with a greatly increased pool of likely plays from you. This makes you a lot harder to predict. For example, in the game earlier I showed against Mawile team, the turn where my Aegislash uses Shadow Sneak on Pawmot was an aggressive read, rather than a middle ground play. I thought my opponent would be frantic for a kill, so I predicted Pawmot would stay in. Now, even though this didn't end up working out, it showed my opponent that I can and will make a suddenly aggressive play. This made me much harder to predict. It also reinforced the idea that my opponent should make obvious plays against me, like going Aegislash on Mandibuzz, because it will sometimes work out. This made my opponent easier to mid-ground against for the rest of the game. Ironically, clicking Shadow Sneak against a Mandibuzz may have ultimately been a positive turn for me, because it put my opponent on edge by shaking up my playstyle. The best players make middle grounds most turns, but occasionally go for hard reads or more aggressive, less calculated, and less safe plays to stay unpredictable. That's all there is to know about middle ground plays. Now get practicing, and remember, it may be hard at first, but with enough practice, it will become automatic. If you have any questions about anything I discussed in this video, please leave a comment and I'll explain. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.